After World War II, a movement from urban areas into the suburbs began all over the United States, and this area was no exception. Many people were moving from Seattle out into the east side, and suburbs began to spring up. The trend was due to a combination of the growing prosperity, a sort of urban unrest, and a growing reliance on the automobile, which meant that people could now live farther away from where they worked because so many families had their own cars. The east side of Lake Washington started growing during this time period in the 1940s and 1950s, and many of the towns on the east side of Lake Washington were incorporated during this era. Bellevue, for example, incorporated in the 1950s. Issaquah had already been incorporated for 60-some years, but during this time period, the population of the town really started growing. Between 1940 and 1970, the population of Issaquah increased by 5 times.
Rowley Properties was started by my father in 1954, and that is when we purchased the section of ground and started building houses. My parents' names, George W. Rowley and Mary Patricia Rowley. Everybody called her Pat. We worked together as a team with my father spearheading the financing and the development aspects, as well as some of the marketing. My job was the financing of the homes, the books of the office, and my mother worked as an interior decorator, helping the people who purchased the homes get the right tile and formica and all of the other stuff that was in the house. It was fun. We had a lot of interesting times together, but again, difficult. But it was just the 3 of us for a long, long time.
My husband was Marvin Mole. He was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1919, and he died 4 years ago. But his memory lives on in the work that I do. We worked together throughout our lifetime together and enjoyed everything that we did. Marvin had always had this interest in land planning, and it just looked to him as if it was a fertile field for doing what he had in mind.
Issaquah at the time was being shepherded by Mayor Bill Flintoff, and Bill was very adamant to his townspeople and to his city council that the city needed growth. And there hadn't been a new home built in Issaquah in 20 years before my father arrived. And Issaquah was having difficulty paying its bills as far as the city was concerned, had very little income other than fees for water and sewer, and so it desperately needed some growth spurt, and Bill Flintoff looked at my father and said, "This is it." So that's how we got started here in Issaquah.
When my husband decided he wanted to practice law, we came to Issaquah because there was no lawyer. He thought he would like his own practice. His own personal practice was so limited because there were so few people that he necessarily began to develop his own interests in acquiring some properties, in seeing the opportunity to do a shopping center.
The one family that I remember the most was the Campbell family. George Campbell and his family, I think, still live on Tiger Mountain. And George logged our property just before we got here. In fact, he was still logging after we purchased it. Squaw Mountain had been logged at least twice and maybe 3 times over the years.
1960, 1959, they began developing that, and my dad actually put in some of the roads, some of the earliest roads, and they built 4 homes initially. There were 4 different houses that were built, kind of scattered.
Squaw Mountain was a very difficult mountain to develop. It was steep, and it made people who came out to look at houses feel as if they were on top of Snoqualmie Pass, number 1. But again, remember that we were asked by the mayor and the city council to come out here. And at that time, the city didn't have adequate water systems. It didn't have an adequate sewer treatment plant. It didn't have any real police department as such. So we were required to provide our own water, put in septic tanks, and do all that. But we worked closely with the City Council and the City Public Works Department, which consisted of one man, Inge Johnson. And it was a hard development. We put in all of those roads that go up through there. We did those ourselves. And in many of those roads, or on many of those roads, my father and I graded them.
They had just paved the road. They had just, there was no public water system. There was, it was all pretty much individual homes and homesteads.
Marvin could persuade me to do just about anything with his reasoning. So I thought I would make the best of it. I felt that being the first house in a large acreage that was planned for development but was in a raw state when we moved struck me as being not exactly what I had in mind, but on the other hand, he was so enthusiastic about things. He could visualize what he was going to do with it.
Out of the logging operation, my dad evolved into the construction, and for a number of years had a small land clearing, land development, dirt work type of construction business, and did a lot for the City of Issaquah, did a lot for developers in the area. Sycamore, Marvin Mole, when he developed that, when he developed what we used to call the high-low shopping center, my dad did that.
Marvin Mole, he was a developer and a lawyer and active citizen in the community.
He developed the first shopping center in Issaquah, and he also then decided that he would like to do a residential community, which is now the Sycamore area. He said he would like to do a beautiful neighborhood that he'd be proud of, and he didn't know exactly what direction to take, so he engaged a prominent architect in Seattle to design some homes to start with. It had been a dairy farm, and there was very little about it that lent itself to views, but we were on the Issaquah Creek, and Marvin started bringing in trees. His idea was to plant as many trees as he could, and for every birthday and anniversary, it seems to me, I got trees, and that was the beginning of Sycamore.
There weren't many codes in those days, and if there were, then the city overlooked those just to get the development in. And a lot of that was done with the belief that you needed to have the development before you'd ever get the real infrastructure that you needed to support the development. It was different than today. Today, we have to put in all of the infrastructure before you can build. In those days, back in the 50s and 60s, we built before all the infrastructure was in, because there wasn't any infrastructure. The city couldn't provide enough water. They could not provide the sewer. Then, after there were enough houses built and the demand was such, then the city could afford to go out and either contract with other areas or build the infrastructure themselves and pay with it with bond issues. But before then, they couldn't, so we didn't really have the rules.
Marvin came out to Issaquah wearing three-piece suits. He immediately sensed that this was not the place for business suits. First went the necktie. After that, he almost never wore a tie. He was informal, very informal, had no side to him. He was comfortable with anybody and everybody. You used to see him around town with rolled plans in his hands.
When my dad came from Eastgate, he was used to building a lot of homes in a relatively short period of time. So this was a major change. But what we had to do, instead of just marketing Mountain Park Estates, we had to market for all of Issaquah. People didn't even know where Issaquah was. We were a stop maybe on the way to Snoqualmie Pass. Most people didn't want to live here. When we got them out here and to the house, they thought that they were way high up. They thought that they were out in no man's land. They thought that they were afraid of bears and cougars. So it was a difficult sell. It was very hard.